A man against himself, against his will. He took his life for lack of friendly hand, for want of one to say, I understand. This time no peace was there, though all was still. Michael Dillon, Out of the Ordinary. The institutional language of 20th century Western medicine, law, and sport demonstrates the structural reliance on definitions that shift to meet administrative, legal, and social needs. These institutions do not produce a definition of gender that is consistent, temporally stable, and empirically verifiable. Rather, they repeatedly redefine gender in ways that preserve their own internal coherence and authority. Gender deviance, therefore, does not mark the boundary of this understanding, but exposes the fact that these systems depend on flexible and contradictory classifications in order to function. This instability is not merely theoretical. In the United States, it has immediate and material consequences for transgender people whose lives are increasingly shaped by these shifting definitions. As one study notes, trans communities are demonized and criminalized through an abundance of anti-trans laws and policies, many of which target trans youth and access. More broadly, opposition to transgender rights has become a central issue on the conservative right, arguably overtaking traditional conservative concerns such as cutting taxes and limiting the federal government, signaling a major shift in political priorities. This trend is reflected not only in public discourse but in legal strategy, as, quote, litigation has proliferated, seeking to use the Constitution and related statutes such as the Religious Freedom Restoration Act to limit or overturn transgender equality measures. The increment of legislation reflects how institutional uncertainty about gender is resolved not through clarity, but through restriction. The scale of this shift is evident in the rapid escalation of legislation. In 2023 alone, over 591 bills targeting LGBTQ rights were introduced across the United States, with dozens already enacted, up from just 19 in 2018, 60 in 2020, and today there are 541, with a substantial portion specifically targeting transgender youth through restrictions on healthcare, education, and public participation. What began as a purported effort to protect children has expanded into what one analysis calls a broader legislative assault on nearly all aspects of trans existence, including laws criminalizing trans people's use of public restrooms and bans on gender-affirming care. In particular, recent strategies have coalesced around two key fronts. One, restricting the participation of TGNCNB, transgender, non-conforming, and non-binary persons in sports, with an emphasis on women's sports. And two, limiting access to gender-affirming healthcare for TGNCNB minors. The consequences of this regulatory response extend beyond legal exclusion into lived experiences of violence and precarity. Nearly half of transgender individuals report experiencing transphobic hate crimes, including severe forms of violence, such as assault and sexual violence, with many incidents going unreported. These experiences are not isolated, but are compounded by intersecting vulnerabilities, including homelessness, incarceration, and economic marginalization. The same institutional systems that fail to define gender consistently also produce the conditions under which trans people are disproportionately exposed to harm. As one activist account emphasizes, lawmaking has become one of the central weapons used against us, and this moment is marked by the urgency of our resistance in an era increasingly defined by such targeted policy efforts. In this sense, the ambiguity of gender is not simply an epistemological issue, it becomes a justification for surveillance, policing, and social exclusion. What emerges, then, is an understanding of why these debates matter. The effort to stabilize gender through medicine, law, and sport is not an abstract intellectual project. It is a political process that shapes who is recognized, who is protected, and who is made vulnerable. As opposition to transgender rights becomes increasingly central within broader political agendas, the regulation of gender operates as a focal point for asserting institutional authority. The rapid expansion of legal and cultural efforts targeting transgender people underscores that the stakes of definitional instability are profoundly unequal. While institutions retain the power to redefine categories, individuals must live with the consequences of those definitions. With that, and before proceeding, it is necessary to define several key terms, as the meanings assigned to them are central to the argument that follows. The term sex refers to the classification of bodies according to biological characteristics, including chromosomes, hormones, and reproductive anatomy. Although often presented as a stable and objective category, medical practice has long had to contend with bodily variation, revealing that these classifications are not as fixed as they appear. Gender, by contrast, denotes the social and cultural frameworks through which individuals are recognized and situated as men, women, or otherwise. It encompasses not only personal identity, but also the systems of classification through which institutions attempt to define and regulate that identity, often inconsistently applied or contested across contexts. A transgender person is typically understood as someone whose gender does not align with the sex assigned to them at birth. Note, trans man or trans masc will refer to those assigned female at birth identifying as male, and trans woman or trans femme will refer to those assigned male at birth identifying as female. While this definition may appear straightforward, it is historically contingent. Earlier medical frameworks employed such terms as transvestite and transsexual, each reflecting different assumptions about the nature of gender and its relation to the body. Finally, the term gender deviance is used here in a descriptive, not normative sense. It refers to the way institutions have historically classified individuals who do not conform to established gender categories. This essay argues that such cases do not merely exist at the margins of these systems, but instead reveal their internal logic, the reliance on definitions of gender that shift according to institutional needs rather than empirical consistency, producing categories that are necessarily unstable over time. Medical knowledge does not produce a single consistent definition of gender. It repeatedly redefines gender in ways that align with institutional constraints and objectives, even when those definitions conflict. In the 1920s, when then Laura Dillon experienced himself as a man trapped in a woman's body, there were no terms to describe his condition. David Oliver Caldwell would not use transsexual in its modern sense until 1949. He understood this, quote, "Suddenly I was struck with an awful thought, for no one had done this for me before. He thinks I'm a woman. It was a horrible moment, and I felt stunned. I'd never thought of myself as such, despite being technically a girl." Michael Dillon. By the 1940s, however, Michael Dillon became the first trans man to undergo phalloplasty or receive testosterone therapy. This shift did not reflect the discovery of a new biological category, but the emergence of new medical language that made certain interventions linguistically expressible. Dillon himself argued that transgender people required medical treatment in the same way as intersex individuals, and they should not have to pay for it. This argument was not incidental, but fully developed in Dillon's 1946 book, Self, A Study in Ethics and Endocrinology, where he rejected purely psychological explanations of gender variance and instead framed it as a physiological condition requiring hormonal and surgical treatment. He wrote that for individuals like himself, quote, "Where the mind cannot be made to fit the body should be made to fit the mind," situating his experience within an already recognized framework of biological abnormality. At the same time, broader medical culture maintained a distinction between biological abnormalities, which justified surgical correction, and psychological abnormalities, which were treated or stigmatized differently. This distinction was not consistently applied, but strategically invoked. The details of Dillon's medical treatment reiterate this inconsistency. Surgeon Harold Gillies falsified Dillon as having hypospadias, a common malformation of the penis, to justify phalloplasty, and even described him as a hermaphrodite in correspondence, despite contradictory evidence. These classifications were not empirically grounded discoveries, they were constructed explanations that enabled surgery within legal constraints, demonstrating that medical definitions of sex were shaped by what institutions needed to permit rather than what they could consistently verify. Laws at the time prohibited genital mutilation, such as removing a penis, but did not govern the addition of one, creating a legal asymmetry that medicine could exploit. Dylan upheld this framing, telling the press he was a male born with a severe form of hypospadias, who had gone corrective operations after developing masculine traits. Over the course of 13 surgeries, a male body was produced through experimental procedures, later described as the first instance of female-to-male gender-affirming surgery. The medical record, the legal framework, and Dylan's own falsified narrative aligned, not because they revealed a stable discovery of sex, but because they produced ad hoc, conflicting classifications that made intervention possible. Beyond his medical significance, Dylan's life resists reduction to a clinical case. He trained as a physician at Trinity College Dublin, worked as a ship's doctor, and later renounced worldly life to become a Buddhist monk in India under the name Lobsang Jivaka. At the same time, Dylan's recognition remained fragile. His life as a man depended on the erasure of his past identity in official records and social contexts, and moments of public exposure threatened to destabilize his status. His own writing reflects this. Quote, "If men and women had a right sense of values, there would have never been any need for this book to have been written and published. But then, if the world had a right sense of values, it would not be in the mess it is today." The problem was not simply misrecognition, but the lack of a consistent institutional framework capable of securing his identity without contradiction. Medicine did not discover Dylan's gender, it produced multiple incompatible explanations. Therefore, its categories failed to stabilize gender as an objective fact, revealing instead that medical classification operates as a flexible tool for managing bodies within institutional limits. The case of Christine Jorgensen reiterates the same pattern. Her transition became publicly articulatable only when doctors framed it as a successful medical correction. At the same time, media and medical professionals advanced competing theories that she was intersex or a pseudo-hermaphrodite, despite no evidence from Jorgensen herself. These explanations were not resolved through empirical verification, they coexisted as alternative narratives that stabilized her case in different ways. Some doctors minimized the novelty of her transition by claiming similar cases were already common in hospitals, further demonstrating how medical authority depended on narrative normalization rather than consistent criteria. Jorgensen's recognition, like Dylan's, depended on narrative coherence rather than empirical certainty. Such deviant cases do not sit outside the system, they expose that the system depends on contradictory and selectively applied definitions in order to render gender legible at all. Diagnostic frameworks make this arbitrariness explicit. Magnus Hirschfeld's 1910 term transvestite grouped diverse lived experiences into a single clinical category, transforming variation into intelligible types. Harry Benjamin's mid-20th century transsexual scale then ranked patients according to how convincingly they articulated binary gender identity, demonstrating that recognition depended on conformity to narrative expectations rather than biological verification. These frameworks were not temporally stable and could collapse when contradictory evidence surfaced. The history of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM, the standard for diagnosis, published by the American Psychiatric Association, reiterates the temporal instability of these classifications. Homosexuality was listed as a disorder until 1973, and transgenderism until 2013. Their removal as disorders marks not the correction of earlier empirical errors, but a shift in institutional language, from pathology to identity, within an evolving social context. What counted as medical truth changed over time, not because bodies changed, but because institutional frameworks redefine gender in response to shifting social and administrative pressures. Finally, the historical record does not show a straightforward progression towards coherence, but a continued reliance on strategically flexible classifications even as medical knowledge advanced. In the cases of Michael Dillon and Christine Jorgensen, contradictory diagnoses did not disappear with improved expertise. They coexisted, were selectively invoked, and were often shaped by legal and social constraints rather than resolved through empirical verification. Even later diagnostic frameworks continued to depend on narrative conformity and institutional criteria rather than stable biological markers. What changes over time, then, is not the discovery of a consistent definition of gender, but the language through which medicine makes certain identities legible and actionable, reinforcing the pattern of adaptation rather than resolution. Medical knowledge does not simply fail to produce a consistent definition of gender, but actively reshapes that definition in order to meet institutional demands. Dillon's case produced multiple incompatible explanations, Jorgensen's depended on competing narratives, diagnostic scales relied on arbitrary criteria, and psychiatric classifications changed across decades. Deviant cases do not sit outside the system, they expose that the system cannot define gender without contradiction. What appears as biological truth is, in fact, constructed, retroactively, stabilized only temporarily, and always vulnerable to collapse. Legal discourse, like medical discourse, does not discover stable categories of identity. It produces them through authoritative language that imposes fixed definitions in order to make social reality administratively manageable. This dynamic is made explicit in Corbett v. Corbett, otherwise Ashley, which serves as a central case study in the juridical construction of sex. In this case, the English High Court was asked to determine the validity of a marriage between Arthur Corbett and April Ashley, a transgender woman. Rather than deferring to medical ambiguity or lived social reality, Justice Roger Ormrod articulated a rigid legal test for determining sex, grounded exclusively in chromosomal, gonadal, and genital criteria fixed at birth. This ruling did not resolve a pre-existing empirical question, it imposed a definition that excluded any recognition of transition, demonstrating that legal categories of sex are constructed to secure institutional clarity rather than reflect empirical complexity. In doing so, the court did not describe reality, but legislated it into being. The logic underpinning Corbett is not anomalous, but reflects a longer legal tradition of stabilizing identity categories through fiat. The Roman legal principle mater semper certa est, the mother is always certain, illustrates how law historically resolves ambiguity by declarative certainty rather than empirical investigation. As legal historian Jan Thomas notes, this principle functioned not because maternity was always self-evident, but because law required an unambiguous point of reference for inheritance and kinship. The certainty of the mother was thus a legal fiction that stabilized social order. Corbett operates analogously. In the face of medical and social complexity, the court asserts an immutable definition of sex, not because it reflects biological consensus, but because legal administration demands categorical clarity. The performative function of legal language is further illuminated by J.L. Austin's theory of the performative utterance, in which statements do not merely describe reality, but bring it into being. The declaration within Corbett that April Ashley was male operates precisely in this way. It is not a descriptive claim subject to empirical falsification, but an authoritative speech act that produces legal consequences, including the nullification of marriage. The court's language functions analogously to the pronouncement, "I now pronounce you man and wife," which creates a marital status through institutional authority. In Corbett, however, the performative utterance works in reverse, dissolving a marriage by redefining one party's legal sex. The authority of the court transforms linguistic assertion into social fact. The reasoning of Corbett v. Corbett reveals even more clearly that its definition of sex was not the outcome of consistent legal or scientific logic, but the selective construction of criteria designed to secure a predetermined conclusion. Justice Ormrod explicitly dismissed a range of factors that might have complicated the classification of April Ashley, including psychological identity, endocrine treatment, and surgical transformation, despite acknowledging their medical relevance. Quote, has been shown to have XY chromosomes and therefore to be of male chromosomal sex, to have testicles prior to the operation and therefore to be of male gonadal sex, to have male external genitalia without any evidence of internal or external female sex organs and therefore to be of male genital sex. Instead, he elevated three criteria: chromosomes, gonads, and genitalia at birth as exclusively determinative, while conceding that even these could present anomalies. As legal scholar Jill Marshall notes, Ormrod's test was selectively reductive, privileging those aspects of sex least susceptible to postnatal change, while ignoring others that were equally recognized within medical discourse. This selectivity is crucial. It demonstrates that the court did not uncover a stable biological essence, but constructed a hierarchy of traits that could anchor a fixed legal category. The resulting definition appears objective only because the judgment suppresses the very inconsistencies it acknowledges, transforming a contested field of knowledge into a single legal truth. Moreover, the evidentiary structure of Corbett underscores how legal authority resolves contradiction not by adjudicating between competing accounts, but by excluding them. Expert medical testimony presented during the case reflected no unified position on the determinants of sex. Endocrinological, psychological, and surgical perspectives offered divergent frameworks for understanding transition, yet the court did not attempt to reconcile these differences. Instead, it reframed the question itself, narrowing the scope of relevant evidence in order to produce a stable legal category, even at the cost of ignoring contradictory knowledge. Historical precedents demonstrate that this juridical construction of identity is neither new nor limited to gender. In Dred Scott v. Sanford, the United States Supreme Court declared that black people were beings of an inferior order, with no rights which white men were bound to respect. This statement did not describe a natural hierarchy, it created a legal reality in which racial subordination was codified and enforced. Similarly, Plessy v. Ferguson institutionalized the doctrine of separate but equal, transforming racial segregation into a legally sanctioned norm. In both cases, the court's language did not passively reflect social divisions, but actively constituted them, rendering contingent social arrangements as naturalized legal facts. Corbett follows this same structure. By defining sex in rigid biological terms, it transforms a contested and variable phenomenon into an immutable legal category. The treatment of gender variance as deception rather than identity further illustrates how law constructs, rather than recognizes, categories of personhood. In 18th century London, the prosecution of individuals associated with so-called molly houses framed gender nonconforming men as fraudulent imitators of women, criminalizing their behavior under sodomy and disorderly conduct laws. Again, the law did not engage with the possibility of alternative gender identities. It imposed a framework in which deviation from binary norms was intelligible only as deception. Corbett reproduces this logic by refusing to recognize April Ashley's gender as legally real, instead treating her as a man masquerading as a woman within the institution of marriage. The instability of these legal constructions becomes visible in moments of resistance, such as Compton's cafeteria riot, where transgender individuals in San Francisco resisted police enforcement of gender norms. As historian Susan Stryker documents, such confrontations reveal the extent to which legal categories depend on coercive enforcement rather than inherent validity. The need for policing underscores the fragility of the categories themselves. If gender were a self-evident biological fact, it would not require continual legal enforcement. The pattern aligns with Michael Foucault's observation that power produces reality, particularly through discourses that define and regulate bodies. Legal discourse, in this sense, does not merely regulate pre-existing identities, but constitutes them as objects of knowledge. Corbett exemplifies this process. By establishing a legal definition of sex, the court produces sex as a knowable, administratable category, even as medical and social evidence suggest its instability. The law's authority masks this constructedness, presenting its decisions as objective truths rather than contingent decisions. It might be argued that legal systems, unlike medical ones, require clear and stable definitions in order to function, and that decisions like Corbett reflect a necessary pragmatism rather than arbitrary construction. However, this argument fails to account for the selective rigidity of legal categories. As demonstrated in Corbett, the court did not adopt the most empirically comprehensive definition of sex available at the time, but rather the one that aligned with existing institutional norms and administrative convenience. Moreover, historical cases such as Dred Scott and Plessy reveal that legal clarity often comes at the expense of justice, producing categories that are internally coherent yet empirically and ethically indefensible. The stability of legal traditions, therefore, reflects not their truth, but the necessity of fixed categories for institutional functioning. Taken together, these examples demonstrate that law does not discover or reflect stable categories of identity. It produces them through authoritative, performative language. Corbett v. Corbett exemplifies this process by imposing an immutable definition of sex that overrides medical ambiguity and lived experience. The Roman principle mater semper certa est, the rulings in Dred Scott and Plessy, and the criminalization of gender variance all reveal the same underlying mechanism. Legal language constructs social reality by stabilizing categories that are, in fact, contingent and contested. In this sense, law does not resolve the question of gender, it forecloses it. This move exemplifies what Michael Foucault describes as the productive function of power. Rather than resolving uncertainty, the law reorganizes it into a form that can be governed. By redefining the scope of admissible evidence, Corbett transforms epistemic plurality into juridical certainty. The case thus exposes the mechanism by which legal systems stabilize identity categories, not through empirical resolution, but through the authoritative delimitation of what counts as relevant knowledge in the first place. Sport provides perhaps the most sustained and revealing institutional attempt to render sex empirically verifiable, and in doing so exposes the same structural dynamics observed in medical and legal discourse. Nowhere is this clearer than in the history of sex verification testing implemented by the International Olympic Committee, IOC, which serves as a central case study not simply in definitional failure, but in the continual reconstruction of sex categories to meet institutional demands. Unlike medicine, which may tolerate ambiguity, or law, which resolves it through fiat, elite sport depends on the premise that sex categories can be clearly and fairly separated in order to sustain competitive legitimacy. However, the repeated revision of verification methods demonstrates that no such stable criterion exists. Instead, sex is repeatedly redefined in ways that preserve the appearance of fairness, even as those definitions generate new contradictions that undermine the system's coherence. The introduction of compulsory sex testing in international athletics during the 1960s was framed as a safeguard against fraud, yet it quickly revealed that the absence of any clear biological standard. Early methods, including physical examinations and later chromosomal testing, such as the Barr body test, assumed that XX chromosomes corresponded unambiguously to female bodies. This assumption was disruptive by the emergence of intersex variations, particularly androgen insensitivity syndrome, AIS, in which individuals possess XY chromosomes but develop typically female phenotypes due to cellular insensitivity to androgens. As Anne Fausto Sterling and others have shown, such cases do not represent anomalies external to the system, but contradictions that expose the limits of chromosomal definitions themselves. Rather than abandoning these definitions, however, institutions were forced to adjust their criteria, demonstrating that sex classification in sport is shaped less by the empirical clarity than by the need to maintain workable categories of competition. The case of Eva Gobukovska provides an early and consequential example of this dynamic. In 1967, Gobukovska, an Olympic gold medalist, failed a chromosomal sex test and was subsequently disqualified, stripped of her records, and banned from competition. Crucially, she had lived, trained, and competed as a woman without controversy prior to testing. Her disqualification did not reveal deception, it revealed that the testing regime itself could not coherently define the category it sought to police. As Kessler and McKenna argue, such cases demonstrate that sex classification in institutional contexts is not the discovery of a natural fact, but the enforcement of a rule that becomes visible only when it breaks down. In this instance, the IOC did not uncover a true sex. It produced a classification that excluded an athlete who had previously fit the category, revealing that the category itself was contingent on shifting institutional criteria. Subsequent shifts in Olympic policy further underscore this pattern. The abandonment of bar body testing in favor of more advanced genetic screening techniques did not resolve the problem, but displaced it. Each technological refinement promised gender accuracy, yet simultaneously revealed greater layers of biological complexity that resisted binary classification. As documented in medical literature on disorders of sex development, genetic testing introduced new ambiguities, including mosaicism and variations in gene expression, which further complicated any attempt to define sex at the molecular level. The history of IOC policy thus illustrates a recursive pattern. Each attempted stabilization of sex generates new exceptions, requiring further revision. Rather than converging on a stable definition, the system continually redefines sex in response to the very contradictions its previous definitions produce. This dynamic persists in the controversy surrounding castor semenya. The increased concern regarding testosterone had begun with the IAAF investigating castor semenya after her success at the 2009 World Championships in Athletics. In 2018, World Athletics began requiring intersex women to medically or surgically alter themselves in order to be eligible, which could prevent them from attending events that serve as Olympic qualifiers. Semenya has refused to take this harmful hormone medication, which saw her banned from participation. Semenya's case marks a shift from chromosomal and genetic testing towards hormonal regulation, specifically the measurement of endogenous testosterone levels as a criterion for eligibility in women's events. Yet this shift does not resolve the underlying issue. It reformulates it in a new register. Testosterone thresholds are themselves arbitrary, as hormone levels vary widely across individuals and overlap significantly between male and female populations. Moreover, the decision to treat naturally occurring testosterone as a form of unfair advantage selectively pathologizes certain bodies while normalizing others. As analyses in sports medicine and bioethics have shown, there is no clear empirical basis for determining a fair cutoff point, and policies governing athletics like Semenya require continual revision in response to legal challenges and scientific critique. The category of female athlete is thus not discovered but maintained through ongoing institutional adjustment. As Judith Butler argues in Bodies That Matter, the materialization of sex is not a pre-discursive given, but an effect of regulatory practices that attempt to stabilize bodies within normative frameworks. Olympic sex testing exemplifies this process. Rather than discovering a stable biological fact, it continually produces and revises the category of sex in order to sustain the institutional logic of competitive fairness. It might be argued that sport, unlike other domains, requires clear distinctions in order to ensure fairness in competition, and that sex verification testing represents a good faith effort to maintain a level playing field. However, the historical record demonstrates that these distinctions are neither clear nor consistently applied. The criteria used to define eligibility have shifted across decades, often in response to specific cases rather than stable principles, and have disproportionately targeted women whose bodies deviate from normative expectations. Moreover, the persistence of controversy, despite increasingly sophisticated scientific methods, suggests that the issue cannot be resolved through improved measurement alone. The problem lies not in the imperfection of existing tests, but in the institutional requirement that sex be made legible as a binary category, regardless of whether such a category can be empirically sustained. With the International Olympic Committee's new policy banning transgender athletes through the use of genetic testing, the governance of sex eligibility in sport has shifted toward a more centralized and ostensibly definitive standard. Rather than delegating criteria to individual federations, the IOC now anchors eligibility in genetic markers, presenting this approach as a clearer, more objective resolution to long-standing disputes. Yet this shift does not eliminate instability, it reframes it. Genetic testing, while carrying the authority of scientific precision, remains subject to interpretation, ethical challenge, and evolving biomedical understanding. What emerges is not a final or uncontested definition of sex, but a newly consolidated regulatory framework that asserts clarity while continuing to provoke disagreement. Questions persist regarding whether genetic traits are definitive, how variations are classified, and whether such criteria can fully account for the complexity of human biology. In this sense, the IOC's policy does not so much resolve the ambiguity surrounding sex in sport as relocate it within the domain of genetic science. Sex remains an administratively constructed category, now enforced through laboratory methods, continuously shaped by institutional priorities and the practical demands of competition, rather than derived from an unambiguous biological truth. Taken together, the history of IOC sex verification testing reveals the same underlying pattern observed in medical and legal discourse. Institutions do not simply fail to produce this needed definition of sex, but repeatedly redefine it in order to preserve the conditions under which they operate. From the disruption of chromosomal definitions by androgen insensitivity syndrome, to the disqualification of Eva Kobukovska, to the continual revision of testing protocols, and finally, to the unresolved controversies surrounding Semenya. Each attempt to stabilize sex generates new contradictions that necessitate further intervention. These cases do not represent failures at the margins. They expose that the category itself is maintained through ongoing adjustment. Sport does not resolve the question of sex, it continually reconstructs it in order to sustain the appearance of fairness and order. The histories of medicine, law, and sport converge on a single point. Gender and sex are not stable categories discovered through empirical inquiry, but contingent constructs produced through institutional practices that require them to be both fixed and adaptable. In each domain, moments of so-called deviance do not mark the limits of otherwise coherent systems. They reveal that coherence is maintained only through shifting, selective, and contradictory definitions. Medical discourse generates shifting and contradictory diagnoses, legal discourse imposes rigid definitions through performative authority, and sport continually revises its criteria in pursuit of a binary that remains empirically unattainable. What appears at first glance as progress towards greater precision is better understood as a cycle of redefinition, in which each new framework produces the very ambiguities it seeks to eliminate. This instability is not a temporary failure to be resolved through better science or clearer law. Rather, it reflects that these institutions rely on definitions of gender as tools for organizing and regulating social life. When individuals fail to fit these definitions, they do not expose exceptions to a rule, but the dependence of the rule itself on flexible and constructed categories. This pattern has broader implications beyond the classification of bodies. As Leslie Feinberg argues, quote, "Trans liberation is not a threat to any lesbian woman or gay man or bisexual person. On the contrary, our struggle bolsters your right to your identity. My right to be me is tied with 1,000 threads to your right to be you. In trans liberation, beyond pink or blue." The instability of gender categories does not threaten social order. It exposes the interdependence of all identity claims on systems that are themselves contingent. Similarly, Audre Lorde's assertion in a talk delivered at Harvard University for Black History Month in 1982, quote, "There is no such thing as a single-issue struggle because we do not live single-issue lives. which underscores that the mechanisms used to define and regulate gender are inseparable from broader structures of power that shape race, class, and sexuality. The attempt to stabilize gender through institutional authority is thus not a neutral scientific endeavor, but part of a wider effort to render complex human variation legible and governable. To recognize this is not to deny the material reality of bodies, but to acknowledge that the meanings assigned to them are shaped by institutional priorities rather than discovered as objective truths. The repeated failure to produce a consistent definition of gender and the necessity of continually redefining it reveals the limits of the systems that attempt to stabilize it. Recognizing the constructed and contingent nature of gender is not only an analytical insight, but an ethical imperative. It reveals that the systems claiming to produce order instead generate harm when they attempt to enforce coherence onto human diversity. The question is no longer whether gender can be definitively categorized, but what is done in the name of that categorization and who bears its cost.